Hi, I'm Samuel C. Spitali, author of How to Win the War on Truth. In this video, we'll look at the truth about liberal media. The idea that the mainstream media has a liberal bias originated during the Nixon era as an instrument of Richard Nixon's vendetta with the press. It was popularized by a group of conservative activists, including Reed Irvine, an economist at Nixon's Federal Reserve Board. Irvine established a right-wing media group called Accuracy in Media, an Orwellian name for an entity whose purpose was, according to former Republican attack dog David Brock, to discredit the media as pro-communist in the eyes of the public, part of a deliberate strategy to build political support for Nixon's Vietnam policies, for the Pinochet military coup in Chile, and more broadly for an aggressively militant U.S. posture toward the Soviet Union. Irvine was joined by two former U.S. military propagandists from the Vietnam War, Abraham Kalish, who taught communications at the U.S. Army Defense Intelligence School, and Bernard Yo, a professor of psychological warfare at the U.S. Air Force University. The group hoped to do for liberal media what Joseph McCarthy did for all those communists in the U.S. government: convince the public they actually existed without having any proof. Under the guise of attacking liberal bias, these critics were really attacking the fact-finding ethic of journalism and the editorial independence of news organizations. By accusing the media of being liberal, the Nixon White House could encourage media outlets to self-censor, treat conservative politicians more favorably, and deflect damaging news coverage, like the carnage of the Vietnam War being broadcast nightly into American homes, all in hopes of swaying public opinion back in Nixon's favor. In 1971, the cause was helped along by libertarian Edith Ephron, who published a book that also claimed the media was biased against Nixon. She misrepresented neutral news broadcasts as having a liberal bias, but her methodology was flawed at best, and she failed to offer documentation to support her findings. Nevertheless, once Nixon discovered the book, he directed his re-election committee to buy up as many copies as they could find, which pushed the book onto the New York Times bestseller list. Reframing the media as liberal was so successful that when Nixon resigned after the Watergate scandal, his supporters believed it was because of unfair press coverage, not because of any crime he may have committed. In 1981, the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative anti-government think tank, published an article in Public Opinion that also argued the media had a liberal bias. Once again, right-wing activists had manipulated the research to justify their findings, but that didn't keep the material from being expanded into a book and circulated in the right-wing press, from National Review to the Wall Street Journal to even Guns and Ammo. The propaganda continued. By 1996, the political right had spent tens of millions of dollars promoting the idea of a liberal media in order to justify the need for their own media ecosystem, one that could counter objective reporting with a conservative worldview, epitomized by the establishment of Fox News later that year, which joined other media institutions founded for ideological ends, like the Center for Media and Public Affairs and the Media Research Center, which the Columbia Journalism Review called propaganda clothed as critique. Ever since, any information that challenges conservative orthodoxy has been purported to have a liberal bias, which implies that whoever uses the term is the only one not biased. However, studies of media dynamics have found that the key difference between conservative media outlets and all the rest is that those viewed as left-leaning are consistently faithful to the standard practices of traditional journalism. The right-leaning outlets have been found to be more centered around partisan propaganda. PolitiFact has found that the majority of false statements on broadcast news are made by conservative speakers. And the slant is even stronger on talk radio, where conservative voices dwarf liberal voices by a measure of 10 to 1. The right has pulled mainstream media rightward so successfully that we often fail to notice. Consider the amount of news coverage questioning Joe Biden's age compared to the age of Donald Trump, even though the two are so close in age that they could have gone to high school together. Recall the media frenzy around the loss of Hillary Clinton's 33,000 emails, most of which were private and for which she was later exonerated. Do you recall the same firestorm when the Bush White House lost 22 million emails, or when the Trump administration ordered staff members to delete their own incriminating emails? What about the uproar when Clinton used a private email address when she was Secretary of State? Yet when Melania Trump, Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, Steve Bannon, Betsy DeVos, and Stephen Miller did the same in the Trump White House, there was little to no uproar. Recall the resistance to Joe Biden forgiving $400 billion in student loan debt, which mainly benefited poor people. Yet there was no such resistance when $800 billion in Paycheck Protection Program loans were forgiven, which was supposed to go to small businesses during the COVID lockdown, yet ended up going to wealthy celebrities like Tom Brady, Khloe Kardashian, Kanye West, and congressmen like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Mike Kelly, and Matt Gaetz. Consider the airtime devoted to conservative politicians expressing concern about the national debt, but only during Democratic administrations. These same voices are notably silent when conservative administrations slash taxes for the wealthy, to the tune of $2.3 trillion under Donald Trump and $8 trillion under George W. Bush, neither of which resulted in public calls for fiscal responsibility or even feigned concern about deficits. Consider how the media question proposals for universal health care, or free college tuition, or funding Social Security, yet never question if we can afford the $170 billion spent annually on corporate welfare, or a $20 billion border wall, or the $1 trillion spent on wars in the Middle East, or the $2.4 trillion spent yearly on the military-industrial complex, a number so extravagant that you could end global starvation with a mere 3% of their annual budget. Have you ever seen anyone on so-called liberal media arguing for that, or voicing concern about fiscal responsibility when the Pentagon failed its last annual audit for the 7th year in a row? Or consider that when there's talk of increasing the minimum wage, the value of which has declined by nearly 50% in the last 50 years, the media questions if it will lead to store closures, unemployment, and inflation. Yet incidentally, there is never talk of not being able to afford CEOs' multi-million-dollar salaries, some as much as 1,000 times more than the average employee. Nor is there talk of how those bloated salaries negatively impact prices or lead to unemployment or store closures or inflation. Since 2009, the federal minimum wage has not increased, yet average CEO pay has increased by 60%. So, if any salaries should be linked to inflation, which has climbed 47% since 2009, it should be those at the top. Speaking of inflation, as it skyrocketed after the pandemic, the media repeatedly put the blame on poor unemployed Americans' meager stimulus checks, even as the world's workers lost $3.7 trillion in wealth, which was redirected to the world's billionaires. The media also failed to blame the monopolistic corporations, raking in record profits and hitting an all-time high in 2023, with profit margins the highest in 70 years, as they used the cover of the pandemic to price gouge. And then there's the matter of media ownership. Fox News is owned by right-wing billionaire Rupert Murdoch, a self-described libertarian who has built an empire by blurring the line between journalism and propaganda. He admitted under oath to knowingly lying to his television audience, and he's publicly backed Donald Trump. CNN is now owned by right-wing billionaire John C. Malone, a self-described libertarian who sits on the board of directors for the unapologetically anti-government Cato Institute, which is bankrolled by the Koch family. Malone has also backed Donald Trump. And there's Sinclair Broadcasting, a conservative media conglomerate that owns 191 local TV stations in 89 U.S. markets, reaching 40% of the population. The owners have donated regularly to Republicans, and they not only backed Donald Trump, but forced its stations to run pro-Trump propaganda segments that promoted baseless conspiracy theories, imitating the Fox News business model. As it acquires new stations, they each shift rightward, disseminating disinformation scripted by the political right. Meanwhile, there are no local media stations owned by progressive political activists. But perhaps the biggest indicator that the mainstream media is far from liberal is its failure to alert the public of our transition from a liberal democracy into the early stages of oligarchy or authoritarianism. Instead of platforming historians, scholars, and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists who have been sounding the alarm since 2015, cable news instead engages in pretense balancing, or both sidesism, giving equal weight where none exists, as an effort to counter that false notion of liberal bias. So instead of having an academic expert who spent their entire life studying the signs of fascism explain to the audience the signs of fascism here at home in America, such as scapegoating immigrants, removing checks and balances, reversing civil rights, stoking political violence, eroding democratic norms, or consolidating power. They just have a left-leaning political pundit call Trump a fascist, so that a right-leaning pundit can counter the claim as being alarmist or hyperbolic, essentially canceling each other out. Not unlike when the media featured climate scientists trying to sound the alarm about global warming alongside climate deniers on the payroll of the fossil fuel industry. As a new Trump era begins, we can expect the mainstream media to shift even further rightward as they try to appease the Trump administration in order to avoid his retribution, which could range from being disinvited to press briefings to having their broadcast license revoked. Trump has promised to censor dissenting voices as part of his free speech policy initiative. This is Orwellian language at its finest, because Trump and right-wing media have long mislabeled fact-checking and even community notes on social media as a form of censorship by the left. So any attempt by the news media to hold the new president accountable will not just be dismissed as liberal bias, but that so-called bias will now be construed as censorship of the president's lies, which means the administration can censor actual fact-checking in order to preserve the so-called free speech of their lies. And Trump has threatened to fire any government employee who colludes with any organization, business, or person to merely label his speech as mis- or disinformation, as well as go after those individuals with the full force of the Justice Department. And he's threatened to cut funding to any university or nonprofit that dares contradict the administration's falsehoods, all but ensuring his lies will not be challenged, corrected, or refuted. These are all steps that authoritarians take on their way to becoming a dictator, following in the footsteps of Viktor Orban in Hungary, Putin in Russia, and Hitler in Nazi Germany. And Trump's billionaire buddies buying up media outlets from Twitter to the Baltimore Sun are all too happy to oblige. The political right's assault on the mainstream media, from Nixon to Trump, has never been about correcting some perceived notion of bias, but about undermining their legitimacy, manipulating the information system for political power in order to push an economic agenda that benefits their billionaire backers. Considering how many Americans now believe things that are verifiably untrue and have become resistant to facts that challenge those beliefs, it's been quite a success, to the detriment of the press, the public, and the political process. If you enjoyed this video or know someone who would benefit from watching it, please share. And to read more about misinformation and myth debunking, check out my book, How to Win the War on Truth. And be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.